The word just means hidden, and there's a New Testament and an Old Testament Apocrypha. I'm assuming you're asking about the Old Testament Apocrypha. These are about 17 books that were written after the time of Malachi, and Jews believed that God's Spirit stopped speaking after Malachi. So you have these books coming up. They're not written for the most part in Hebrew, they're written for the most part in Greek, and they were never accepted by Judaism. They are Old Testament books like Enoch. It's about Old Testament characters, Old Testament times, and some of them, like First and Second Maccabees, are our primary source of history of the 150 years before Christ. So it's not that they're bad, but it's that they're obviously not written in the same way that the Old Testament was written, and so the Jews never accepted it. When the Old Testament was translated into Greek, the Septuagint, they were included. And so the church has always known about these books, but the basic position is that you can read them, but you cannot base theology on them. The stories of Tobit and Bel and the Dragon and Susanna, I mean, they're interesting stories. They're inspiring stories, some of them. But they were always viewed as secondary. And when Jerome came to do the Latin Vulgate, which was kind of like the King James in Latin for 1,000 years, he did not want to include it, but because of political pressure, he had to. And what happened then, when you get up to the time of the Reformation, they still were in the Bible because they were in the Vulgate, the Latin, viewed as secondary. And Luther comes along, and some of the Catholic doctrines find their basis, or at least they claim their basis, is in some of these apocryphal books, praying for the dead, indulgences, some of these doctrines that Luther really did not like. And he had a theological issue with him. And there was a real rise in interest in Greek and Hebrew in the Reformation and the Renaissance as well. And because they weren't written in Hebrew, they were naturally suspect. And so what Luther did was that these books have been interspersed throughout the Old Testament. He pulled them all and made a separate section. So it was the Hebrew Bible, there was the Apocrypha, and there was the New Testament. And then within about 100 years, publishers weren't even publishing the Apocrypha anymore because they obviously were secondary. It was 1527, the Council of Trent was the only time that there was a council dealing with the issue of the Apocrypha. And at the Council of Trent, the Catholic Church said the Apocrypha is part of the Bible. So they had never stated officially that it was part of the Bible. But in reaction to the Reformation, in reaction to Luther, in reaction to him dropping them out, in essence, they declared them to be part of the canon. So that's why the Catholic Bible has about 17, I think it is, books that aren't in the Protestant canon. The important thing there is that they never said it officially until they were reacting against Luther. So there never was a formal statement, hey, these are in the Bible. They were always suspect. They were always viewed as secondary until the council.
So we can say that out of envy or of jealousy, they included those apocrypha.
Yeah, and it was a reaction against Luther. Whatever the motivation was, they wanted to separate themselves from what Luther and Calvin and the other reformers were doing. And, they wanted a basis for indulgences, right? Because they were collecting indulgences. The decision wasn't made because they truly believed they were from God. It was a reaction against Luther.
In addition, there is no theological basis, no doctrinal basis to the apocrypha.
No, and in fact, Paul says that sin had its origin with Adam. Ben Sirach says that sin had its origin from Eve. So if you're going to include the Apocrypha, you have a flat-out theological contradiction that cannot be resolved. And so, I mean, if you want to include the Apocrypha, you got a real problem with a significant theological contradiction.